Hi, my name is Dr. Annette Bosworth, and this is another one of my little lessons for patients and people to learn about the ketogenic diet. Today we're talking about some of the basics, which begin with what kind of food do you eat and how do we talk about that in relationship to its fuel. So when I first begin talking about this, I like to make sure we go back to the basics. There are three types of fuel that you can put inside your body. One is fat, one is protein, and one is carbohydrates. On a ketogenic diet, 80% of the diet is fueling the body with fat. When you do that, you make ketones, which is where we get the name ketogenic diet. So I have a chart that I start by showing patients, and it looks at the macronutrients in different groups. In different foods. We look at 100 grams of each one of these different foods, and we start with sugar. If you take 100 grams of sugar, that is all carbohydrates. When you look at 100 grams of olive oil, that's 100 grams of fat, which is one of your other macronutrients. If you take eggs are actually mostly water, but they are also made of protein and fat pretty equally, and a tiny, tiny bit of carbohydrates. If you take lard or butter, those are also very high fat contents, only adding some water to the butter to make it different than lard when it comes to your macronutrients. Other things like broccoli, again, broccoli is mostly water, but it does have some carbohydrates and a little bit of protein in it. After dancing through those food groups, I like to show patients that these three macronutrients of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats can be thought of fueling your body, kind of like we use different ingredients to fuel a campfire. So if you think of a campfire and you're trying to build a fire and you add a whole bunch of pine needles or leaves to your campfire and you add just a spark of energy, one match, the whole campfire goes up in flames. With that analogy, that is what happens to our body when we fuel it mostly on carbohydrates. You shoot your energies up really high, but it only lasts for a short period of time. Just like with pine needles, if all you're burning is pine needles, you will shoot the energy up really high in your campfire, but it will not keep you warm all night long. If you add some sticks or some twigs to your campfire, analyze that by thinking of it as if you add protein to your diet, your carbohydrates are going to still burst way up and down, but your proteins are going to last about 4 hours when it comes to energizing your body. The striking thing to notice that is similar between carbohydrates and protein is the energy shoots up and then it shoots down. Whenever the energy goes up and down, like it shows in this chart, we get a craving, we get a hunger. The more we bounce our sugars up and down, the more we stimulate hunger and want for food, stimulate cravings. If you've ever tried to fuel your campfire with just little twigs, it just takes a lot of energy. You're eating all the time, you're fueling your fire all the time with your campfire, just like you would be eating a lot of the time when you fuel your body with protein. That's the striking difference when we fuel our body with fat. So if we look at the last curve on this chart, there's a very slow uptake on the energy and it lasts for a long time. The energy doesn't look like it gets very high because this is analogous for your first campfire when you're trying to build a fire out of just logs. If you've ever done that, you've put just logs in a fire and tried to take a match to those logs, you probably worked really hard at staying cold. You didn't make much of a fuel. It takes some effort and some transitioning to get your logs to begin to burn. And just like when I transition patients over from a high carbohydrate or a high protein diet to a high fat diet, those first few days, their energy isn't great. It does take a while to get the fuel burning. When I take away the carbohydrates and we take away the protein and 80% fat, it's kind of like the beginning stages of a campfire where you're working with just logs. Once we finally get the logs burning, once we get their body burning fat for fuel, it is incredible how each day their energy gets better and better and better. Just like your campfire, if you add a log to already burning logs, it will incorporate that into the fuel of that campfire and you can sustain the heat all night long. It's very similar to what happens with patients. When they fuel their body with fat, the energy isn't great those first few days, but by the end of the second week, many of my patients tell me that it feels like they have reversed time. They have taken back the clock. They haven't had energy like this since they were a kid. So that's the basics on fuel. You got your carbs, you got your protein, and you got your fat. On a ketogenic diet, it is not a high protein diet. It is not a high carb diet. It is a high fat diet. And the reason we talk about energy fuel is because the first few days can be a little rough, but if you get to the end of the second week, it's quite a rewarding transition.